All right, welcome everyone to Econ 101 review for class. I know you might be struggling studying for finals. Today, we're going to go over the entire course in less than 50 minutes. How does that sound? Let's get some energy up. All right, starting off, we have the principles of Econ. SOMI, what does that stand for? Scarcity, limited resources available. O, opportunity cost. Every single cost is opportunity cost. M, decisions at the margin, mean when you want one more. That is making decisions at the margin. And the last one, incentives. People like money. People like cheap things. Incentives. Make sure you remember those four key components. Next up, we have positive versus normative statements. Positive statements, those are things that can be proved. Those are scientific facts. They cannot be disputed. Normative statements look for words such as to, should, feels. Those are statements about someone's opinion, about how they feel that the world should be, about what they think should be. Now, another thing to always remember is the PPF. What does the PPF stand for? Exactly. So, if we take a look over here at a very beautifully drawn PPF curve, whoa, it's curved. Why is it curved? Yeah.
Increasing opportunity cost.
Sort of. Kind of. But on a question, you also want to talk about productive resources. Look up there. You see those apples? Those look like some pretty sweet apples. But you see those other apples? Those are rotten. Now imagine that we were an applesauce manufacturer, and we could either make 10 jars of applesauce or 10 cans of pumpkin, right? We start off by using these delicious apples. We're making one apple for one can of applesauce. But then, now it's rotten. They're bad. Now we need like 5. We gotta cut off all the moldy parts, right? So we're losing out on our productive resources. That is one of the reasons, along with increasing opportunity cost, of why it is curved out. Can we produce here?
No.
Can we produce here?
Yeah.
Should we?
No.
Where do we want to produce? Along the curve, exactly. And another thing to keep in mind with at the margin, MB equals MC. What does that stand for? Marginal benefit equals marginal cost. That is literally the one thing you should remember. But what is marginal benefit? Another word for it is marginal revenue. We'll get to that later. Last thing, tricky trading. Remember fish? So basic, yeah. It's not in all cases, but it's like that's why it's in brackets. So you just got to remember, because sometimes you want to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we'll get to that later. Now, tricky trading, right? You have different opportunity costs. You got to find out when to trade. These are kind of the steps to go. So first, you got to determine a fraction of the opportunity cost, and then you also got to watch out for whether they're giving you time. So let's say it takes you 5 hours to make a plane, or they're giving you resources. So let's say you can make 5 planes or 10 trains. Make sure you understand the differences between those and how to calculate those opportunity costs. And then you're going to compare the lowest opportunity cost. The lowest opportunity cost is the one that will be specializing in that item. And then lastly, you'll be given a trade ratio. And if that trade ratio is in between the two opportunity costs, then you're good to trade. Otherwise, only one of them or neither of them will want to accept it. We're going to go into that a little bit more in depth. So suppose Joe produces 10 trucks for 5 cars. We're not given time, we're given items. But Bain can make 12 trucks, or 7 cars, right? So the opportunity cost for Joe, let's say, he could produce 1 car or he could produce 10 trucks. That's just a fraction, right? So his opportunity cost would be 2. And then for Bain, it's the same thing, but this is a little more tricky because it's a fraction. Fractions are pretty confusing. Now, we can see that Bain would make cars because his opportunity cost, 12 divided by 7, is lower than 2, right? So therefore, in a trade, who would make trucks? Joe, exactly. Okay, now, suppose that there is a trade ratio of 3 trucks for 2 cars. What would they do? Now, I know you might be trying to do the math in your head. I find that it's really helpful to use the original numbers. So rather than having to use the opportunity cost, it's sometimes simple to just use the original numbers. Does anyone have an answer of what will happen if that trade ratio is in place? This is a great question, right? Any thoughts? We'll give it like 5 seconds. Okay, so let's go about just like a simple way to look at it, right? So 3 trucks. Who's making trucks? Joe. All right. Who's making cars? We know that Bain is making cars. So for Joe, if this trade ratio exists, he could get 15 trucks or 10 cars. Does that make sense? You're basically using the original numbers. Now, for Bain, he could get 12 trucks or 8 cars. Now, Bain is producing cars. So if he traded, he would have to essentially make an extra car to get the same amount of trucks. So Bain would say no, and Joe would say yes. Does that make sense? Okay. Next up is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is split into implicit and explicit. Explicit is the actual cost of the thing. Implicit is the value of the next best option you're foregoing minus the cost of what you're foregoing. Let's say you want pizza. It costs $5, right? Or you can get chicken wings. Chicken wings to you are worth $8, but chicken wings cost $4. So what would the opportunity cost of purchasing a pizza be? Why would it be $5? All costs are opportunity costs, right? Why would it be $13?
There's the explicit cost of the $5.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but the chicken wings cost. So it's $9. So the way you calculate that is by $5 is the actual cost of the item. That's the explicit cost. And now your implicit cost, the value of the chicken wings are $8 minus the cost of the chicken wings is $4. So that net benefit of the other option would be $4. So your opportunity cost of pushing that pizza is $9. So that's basically how much that pizza is valued to you. Any questions? This is a neat way of looking at it. All costs are opportunity costs. All right, so now we finished the first 2 units of economics. Let's go. We're moving on to supply and demand. Basically, a few things to keep in mind is there's a difference between quantity supplied and supplied. Quantity supplied, denoted by small q, is just the amount. Supply is the actual curve. It is the function that you are given to determine supply. Same with quantity demanded and demand. Where supply and demand intersect, that is equilibrium. Now, demand has a law. What is the demand law? The law of demand. Yeah. Exactly. So it'll be downward sloping because on our curve, we have price for some reason is on the y-axis and then quantity is on the x-axis. Things that can influence supply and demand. One thing is price, but price doesn't impact the curve. You only shift along the curve. So if we had 2 curves here and you're changing the price, you're not moving the curves, you're only moving along the curves. But the things that can shift the curves are everything else. So you have input prices, information, technology, substitutes, and complements. This is an important one. If demand, let's say you have hot dogs and hamburgers, right? So those would be substitutes, right? Hot dogs, hamburgers. If the price of one substitute goes up, the demand for the other one would go up because it's an alternative. But it's opposite for supply. Let's say you could produce strawberries or blueberries. If the price of strawberries goes up, you want to stop producing the blueberries because you're getting less money for it and produce more strawberries. So that's the one thing to keep in mind is those are flipped between supply and demand. Everything else is basically the same pretty much. And then also expectations. If you increase, you're moving both curves to the right. If you're decreasing, you're moving it to the left. A simple thing to keep in mind if you're just trying to analyze different questions is suppliers like high price, they're getting paid a lot. Consumers don't. We like cheap things because it's much better. Now, there's one thing to keep in mind, top right, units. Don't forget your units on the exam, otherwise you'll lose half a mark, like some people did. So don't forget your units. Now, when you're given a question, just draw it. The more graphs, the better. So if there's a market, but then there's a market of inputs or a market of substitutes or complements, draw both the market and then also the market of like a smaller market. Draw as many graphs as you can. The more graphs, the higher marks you're probably going to get. So as you can see in the graph, you can shift one and then it changes the equilibrium. Equilibrium is always where that supply and demand are going to intersect in this case. And then when you're changing, you can maybe have one change or two shifts. And now let's say there are two shifts. One thing to keep in mind is that one change between price or quantity will always be for sure, and one of the changes will be ambiguous. So basically, you can memorize that or you can draw a graph, but essentially, let's say supply and demand both increase. You know for sure that quantity is going to increase. Price, I don't know. And then supply decreases, demand increases. You know for sure that price is going to increase, and everything else is on there. But if you just draw it out, it should be pretty straightforward. But remember, one is guaranteed, one is ambiguous for two changes. Right? If only one change, you know both what will happen. Any questions on that? All right, sick. Let's go over a few different formulas. So in this slideshow, we're given an equation, right? Quantity demanded equals 40 minus 4p. Now, remember the thing I said, how it's flipped? This confuses or it complicates things a little bit. So now our slope in this equation is actually 1 over the slope in this graph. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. So the slope in the equation is 1 over the slope in the graph because it's switched. Does that make sense? Okay, keep that in mind. Now, a few things to be able to make sure you, or helpful things to calculate is the price intercept. So basically, you just set quantity demand equal to 0, also known as the choke price, or the quantity intercept, basically where quantity demanded or price equals 0, what quantity demand is, and that'll help you calculate surplus. And then there's a few different ways about going about surplus. Basically, that blue region right there is consumer surplus. It's everything that's below the demand curve above the price. So you can calculate that by taking the price intercept minus the actual price, and then it's a triangle, so you times it by the quantity and divide it by 2. Flipped for the producer surplus, and then total surplus is them added together, or you could just do the difference between the consumer price intercept and the producer price intercept. And then for any changes in surplus, there's the parallelogram calculation, which you can use, which is basically having two different points, making a parallelogram, and then calculating that area, which is the change. And then you can calculate the deadweight loss, which is the max possible surplus you can get minus the current surplus you can get. So that's essentially the definition. And normally it's shown by a triangle like that. But we'll kind of get more to that later. And essentially, yeah, just remember that the slope in the equation is actually 1 over the slope. And remember that it's important to be able to calculate the price intercept, quantity intercept of both supply and demand. And then those are a few formulas for calculating the surplus, which is pretty easy. All right, government intervention. We have floors and taxes. Okay, this is where it gets sometimes tricky, especially for me. But basically, one thing to remember, floors go above, ceilings go below for them to be binding. So a price floor goes above equilibrium and then it's binding. If it's below equilibrium, it's not binding, nothing happens. Don't worry about it. Ceilings help consumers by basically saying you can't raise it above this price. Floors help producers saying like no one can buy it cheaper than this price. And then Q star, as Clive likes to call it, is basically where the price first touches a curve. So as you can see here, we've added in a price ceiling. Now you're basically going across that price ceiling, and wherever it hits first, so right in there it hits the supply curve, that's going to be Q star. So then you can go up to that. That's the price of it as well. And then you can calculate whether there is a shortage or a surplus based on the difference of the two graphs. Now, the one thing that you're going to be asked to calculate for price ceilings is the consumer producer surplus and the deadweight loss. Now, there's a few reasons why there's a deadweight loss. One of them is because of quantity reduced, so that's the surplus or shortage. Then the other thing is inefficient allocation. This is the thing that I want to focus on because it is like a little tricky and confusing. But basically, for this price ceiling here, there's going to be so many consumers, a mob of people who are willing to buy this product, right? They're going to hoard the stores. Now, to one person, let's say it's Jacob, he values this water bottle at $10, right? But for another person, Jimmy, he values that water bottle, this is a little water bottle, at $2, right? And the price is $2. The price ceiling is at $2. Now, Jacob and Jimmy are wrestling to get into the store, right? And there's hundreds of people similar to them. How do you know who's going to get this water bottle? Could be Jacob, it could be Jimmy. If Jacob got this water bottle, there would be a lot bigger consumer surplus than if all the Jimmys got this water bottle. That's why there's an inefficient allocation. And the way to calculate that is by you taking the maximum consumer surplus. So for Jacob, that would basically be his value of the item minus the price of the item. And then the minimum consumer surplus, which would always be 0. And again, it's Jimmy's value of the item minus the cost of the item. You add those two numbers together and you divide it by 2 to get an average. So now you have the average consumer surplus. And then all you have to do is times that by the quantity, and that is a realistic surplus. Does that make sense? Okay, sick. Deadweight loss cannot be 0, by the way. That's another thing to keep in mind. All right, now taxes. They're even more fun. But basically, there's a difference between legal incidence and economic incidence. Legal incidence is like, yo, consumers, you got to pay the tax, or producers. Economic incidence is how much proportionally of that tax each people pay. So do consumers pay 50% of the tax, 25%? That is their economic incidence. And it's always the same. It doesn't matter. So it's always the same whether you tax the consumers or the producers. The economic incidence will always be the same. And now when you introduce a tax, it'll shift supply curve up, or the curves up or down. It'll shift the supply curve up, and it'll shift the demand curve down. So just really quick, you have your two curves, and then let's say we wanted to add a tax. We'll tax producers. So we're shifting the curve up. And then there's these things called PC, which is the price of consumers, and the price of producers. So price of producers is what the producers receive. Price of consumers is how much it costs of consumers to buy it. I like to think of, if you're going to a store purchasing cereal, right? How much is that costing you? And then how much is the factory getting? Which will be an example later. And then depending on the elasticity of the curve, if it's more inelastic, those people will pay more of the tax. So more inelastic, those people pay more of the tax. Make sure you're using the producer price or the consumer price when calculating surplus. So you're not using any other price, like the price there. So this would be your producer surplus, this would be your consumer surplus, and then this is your tax revenue, which is basically the tax difference between it times the new quantity. And then you have your deadweight loss here. Now, there was a really good question on Pizzazz. You know how we were just talking about inefficient allocation? So there's realistic and unrealistic deadweight loss, or consumer and producer surplus. Is there inefficient allocation with taxes? No, exactly. There isn't, because there is no surplus or shortage, right? Because it is actually shifting the supply or demand curves, it's not causing a shortage, so there's not going to be hundreds of people crowding the stores wanting to buy $2 water bottles, okay? So there is no inefficient allocation with taxes. Yeah? Total surplus, just that plus that. Oh, you can also add that in as well. But yeah, so you can add in the social surplus with that, producer surplus, consumer surplus, and then you can get your deadweight loss in the triangle there. And then you're able to have no deadweight loss if something is perfectly inelastic, and the revenue would be maxed at an elasticity of 1 that'll come up later. Basically, yeah, so here are just some examples. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have to balance between fair and efficient with taxes. So you can either have a fair, like a lump sum tax, an efficient lump sum tax, so everyone pays the same amount, or a fair tax, like the bracket system. So as you make more money, you pay more in tax. But you can't really have an equal balance of the two. And then here, the consumer pays a bunch of money, and then in between it, the government takes a little bit, and the producers receive a little bit less. So that is why the producer price, the consumer price of consumers will always be higher. All right, elasticity. This is fun. One thing to keep in mind is you don't really have to consider the signs during your calculations. The one thing you just have to keep in mind is the words about it. So if it says increase, increase, it's positive. Increase, decrease is negative. Decrease, decrease is positive. That way you don't have to worry about which price to minus, which quantity to minus. Ignore all of the signs, just minus whatever you want basically. And then if it's increase, increase, at the end make it positive, negative, or positive. Two different ways of calculating surplus. Midpoint method, quantity is always going to go on top. Change in quantity, always on top. And change in quantity, that'll be first quantity plus the second quantity, the quantity minus the other quantity, so first quantity minus the second quantity, all over the first quantity plus the second quantity divided by 2. And then for demand elasticity, that's over first price minus the second price, all over price 1 plus price 2, all divided by 2. That's the midpoint method. Point form is 1 over slope times price over quantity. What is 1 over slope? It's the slope that's given in the formula, right? So make sure you don't flip that. When you're given a formula, boom, that's 1 over slope. You just times that by the price, by the quantity, and you're good to go. Inelastic means less sensitive to price changes, and as time goes on, elasticity is going to increase as consumers or producers can find other alternatives to use. The elasticity of demand is always negative, so make sure you write that, or you can just use the absolute value of demand to help it. And then here you can see that along a linear demand curve, the midpoint is going to have a unit elastic, so it'll be an elasticity of 1. Above that is going to be elastic, and below that is going to be inelastic. And 0, perfectly inelastic, and an infinity is perfectly elastic demand. Can anyone tell me what that vertical line is? What type of demand? Vertical line up there. Exactly. Perfectly inelastic. And then perfectly elastic. Little bit of a quantity effect. So we know that total revenue is maximized when elasticity equals 1, which is in the midpoint. So if the elasticity right now is 2, should the firm decrease price or increase price? Decrease price, exactly. So you're bringing it down to where elasticity equals 1. Opposite if it is inelastic, and the price effect will dominate because as you increase prices, better for your revenue. So the price effect dominates for inelastic demand, similarly with like the quantity effect. There's a few other elasticities. So supply, essentially the same as demand, but positive. If you have a dead painter, that's perfectly inelastic because you can't get any more no matter how much the price goes up. And then income, all you have to do is just make the percentage change in income on the bottom. And if the elasticity is less than 0, it's inferior. It's between 0 and 1, it's a normal good. And if it's greater than 1, it's a luxury. Basically it. And lastly is cross price elasticity. Again, quantity of the one good is always on top, and then you just put the change in price of the other one on the bottom. C minus if it's complement. If it's negative elasticity, it's complement. Substitute, it's positive. And if it's 0, it's unrelated. But you can't say anything about elastic or inelastic cross price elasticity. Yeah.
I have a question about income elasticity.
Yeah.
What happens to the fraction of income depends on the good if elasticity is greater than 1 and income rises?
It increases.
Why is that?
Because it's like a luxury good. So it's like, imagine you have a sports car, right? people, and let's say everyone's making $100 a day. People wouldn't be able to buy that. And now you increase that up, they'd be able to buy that. So it's the percentage change in demand is greater than the percentage change in income. So the change in quantity is on top, change in prices on, or income is on the bottom. For a normal good, it would be less. Because, so let's say it's like a fraction, right? So let's say we'll just use like random numbers. Let's say change in quantity is 4, and then in order for it to be a normal good, it would have to be something greater than 4, so it'd be 5. So then your income is going up, but you're not getting more than what you want. Oh, and then lastly, if it's a more specific thing like 2% milk versus all milk, it's going to be more elastic because people could just go to alternatives. Yeah. As time goes on, elasticity increases because people can find other substitutes. They can go to available options or change their ways. Keep that in mind. Okay. Inputs. Basically, there's short run and long run. Short run, 1 input is fixed. Long run, 0 input is fixed. The basic only thing you have to keep in mind is for short run, if the average variable cost is greater than price, shut down. The average total cost in long run is greater than price, you leave, find something different. In the short run, there's diminishing marginal returns. In the long run, there's increasing, constant, and diminishing returns to scale. What that means basically is if you have a kitchen, you can put in like more equipment, more stuff, and then you'll be getting more efficient. And then at some point, the more capital you add to that kitchen, you won't get any more benefit from it. And then eventually, something will happen. You'll be crowding, overcrowded, or have to expand to a new country. So it'll cost you more for each additional project. So that's when you have diminishing returns to scale. How do you pick the number of so basically, with long run, you're able to choose the amount of capital or your fixed input from the short run. So if you had a curve like this, and then you have your different curves. So this is with 1 factory, 2 factory, 3 factory. You'll essentially pick whichever quantity you want, and then the lowest cost is the amount of factories that you'll produce, because you always want to produce at that lower cost. And the marginal cost is always going to look the same. It's just going to go down, and then it's going to go up, and it's going to hit average total cost at its minimum. And what's the difference between a firm and a market demand curve in a competitive market? For a firm, the demand is always going to be perfectly elastic, and then for the market, it's going to follow the demand law. This is because in a perfectly competitive firm, if a firm increased their prices just a little bit, consumers are going to go to another firm. Are there any questions on that? Yeah.
Can you explain why profit will always go back?
Oh, excellent question. Yeah. So in a perfectly competitive market, there are no barriers to enter. So in the market, let's say that they are producing profit, then more firms are going to want to enter that market because there's no barriers, and that is going to shift supply, increase supply, which will drive down price all the way until the firms like average total cost, so then they'll be making no profit. Similarly, if they're losing money, firms will exit the market, which shifts the supply curve left, which increases the price up to the point where all the firms are breaking even the entire time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Externalities. So this is, I would argue, kind of confusing. I don't know how you guys find it, but basically now the supply and demand curve aren't just the marginal benefit or the marginal cost, but now they're this thing called the marginal social benefit and that's supposed to be marginal social cost, which equals the marginal private benefit, which was the old marginal benefit, plus the external benefit. Basically, all it means is that now we're considering other implications like pollution or education, smartness, intelligence, and we're going to want to produce where our marginal social benefit equals our marginal social cost. In the questions, one of these will be set to 0, which is really helpful for the most part. And then basically in the graph here, you can see that right now for an unregulated market, this is with negative externalities. The marginal private cost does not equal the marginal social cost. So the market would produce too much quantity at MPC equals MSB, but we want to produce at the intersection of the yellow star. So how do you do that? Is you tax it. And you tax it the amount of the externality at the optimal quantity. So basically in taxing this is a really easy setup to go. You get an equation for the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit. You might have to add together marginal private cost and marginal external cost. Add those together, and then you set those two equal to each other. You find the optimal quantity, and then you determine what the externality is at that quantity, and then that is your price, or your tax, or your subsidy. It's a subsidy if it's a positive externality, and it's a tax if it's a negative externality, because a positive externality will always produce too little, negative externality will always produce too much. So that subsidy or that tax brings it together, and then you're done. And taxes are something that can eliminate the deadweight loss, and they're not actually a social cost because it's benefiting society, because those taxes can go into like education systems or service systems, so it's not actually costing society anything. But this tax can eliminate the deadweight loss caused by too much pollution or too little pollution, and that deadweight loss will be a triangle, and that triangle will always point to the optimal quantity. So that's one way to kind of remember which side of the lines you want to draw that quantity on. Any questions about that? Yeah.
What area on the graph has been lost?
Without the tax, it's the points to the optimal quantity. So wherever the optimal quantity is, it points towards that. So this one, it would basically be like, I don't really have, basically like points to the optimal quantity. Okay? And then when you draw out the graph, you'll probably do a better job than me. But essentially it's that too much negative, like too much pollution in this case. That's what causes the deadweight loss. All right. Damn, we're zooming through this. All right, last one is monopoly. One thing to keep in mind is that the slope of the marginal revenue of a monopoly firm is double the slope of the demand. That's basically the one important thing to keep in mind. Monopolies, they're price makers as opposed to perfectly competitor or price takers. They could either decide what price they want to sell at or what quantity they want to sell at. Not both. Now, where do they want to produce? Exactly. But now, our marginal revenue isn't our demand. It's separate. So before we could consider it, but now it's different. So the slope is 2 times the slope for marginal revenue. So right now we're going to be creating deadweight loss because the monopoly firm, in order to maximize profit, is going to be producing too little. They're going to be producing where demand is at least a unit elastic or greater. They can't produce in an inelastic range because, as we know, more revenue, more money. So monopolies, they'll have barriers to enter, whether that be legal, infrastructure, patents, and they are able to achieve long-run profit because of these high barriers to enter. The deadweight loss it makes is from the lower quantity produced in the total market. And while for the monopoly, the best outcome is produced where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, for society as a whole, the best outcome is produced where demand equals marginal cost. So you can calculate the deadweight loss between the difference of those surpluses, and you can also calculate what the optimal quantity versus the actual quantity will be. And you can determine profit by going to where their average cost is at the quantity that they produce, go up to their average cost, that's their total average cost, and then you price minus average total cost at that quantity times quantity equals profit. Any questions about that? Yeah. Yes. You can say that for certain. Because, well, not like in real life, no, you can't say that for certain. But in economics, you can say that for certain because they want to they would be able to increase price if it was inelastic and make more money. And it was also in the notes. So yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind. There might be a question talking about, well, will this monopoly operate at like an inelastic range? No, they'd increase price, so then they'd be operating at a different part of the demand curve. Good question. Yeah, that's my knowledge as of thus far. So in calculating this, it's a little complicated, but basically you're gonna rearrange the formula. So if let's say we're given that same formula, what is the slope? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then what is the monopoly slope? 2 times that. It's going to be negative a half. Exactly. So then, oh, I guess it was shown up there. But now you have the slope of MR, and then you know that it has the same price intercept. That's another thing I wanted to mention. So it'll both start at 40. So then, again, you can create the equation from that of the marginal revenue. And then you just set that marginal revenue equal to whatever your marginal cost equation is. And then boom, optimal quantity. And then you can mess around with things. But basically, you have the equation, you rearrange it, or you just figure out what the slope is. And then you add that, or you put it into the equation with the same price intercept. And then you're good to go. And then, like this train, you're going to be on your way to absolutely crush your Econ 101 final. And then here's just some key terms to keep in mind. Marginal cost, marginal benefit, willingness to pay, willingness to accept. Cost, Jacob, what is the cost always? Without looking at the slideshow?
Cost always.
Yeah, what is cost?
Price it says this.
Opportunity cost. And then remember, marginal benefit is basically the marginal social benefit, which is basically the demand curve. Marginal cost is essentially, those are interchangeable. And then this is key differences. Economic surplus is basically like your total surplus, but then your shortage and surplus is when you have too much demand, surplus is too much supply. Somebody asks you for a surplus or an economic surplus, make sure you know the difference. Economic surplus is that producer-consumer total surplus, but surplus is just when there's too much supply. Everyone wants to sell water bottles because they're selling them for $1 million each. So there's so much supply of water bottles, but no one wants to buy them. So there's a surplus. So just keep that in mind. And then, yeah, that's basically my condensed version of a $600 course in 38 minutes. Are there any questions? I hope that was slightly helpful to you guys, made you look at economics in another way, that you know how many trucks to get and pizza and what it really costs. But yeah, if there are any questions, thank you. I might do one for math too, I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, thanks for coming, guys.